I'm Mark Halperin, and I'm Mark Halperin. And with all due respect to Monday through Thursday, this is a special Freaky Friday edition of With All Due Respect. Mark and I will be here all night, but this week in politics was so bigly, no single co-anchor could possibly do the job. So our guest host tonight is three guest hosts tonight, starting with Bloomberg's one and only Margaret Taleb, who's in our Washington bureau. Margaret, welcome.
I'm Mark Halperin. Thank you.
We're going to talk first about a trio of top Republicans who had to deal one way or the other with Donald J. Trump, billionaire, this week. First up, Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, had a Capitol Hill press conference yesterday where he said he has no plans now to unendorse Donald Trump. While many of our colleagues in the media reported that as Ryan effectively closing the door on walking back his endorsement. According to our sources, Ryan's carefully chosen words, in fact, were meant to deliberately keep that door ajar. And when asked about Trump in an interview with NBC News' Chuck Todd that will air in full on Meet the Press this Sunday, Ryan essentially told his fellow House Republicans to run for the hills if they want to.
Do you think it is that members in the House Republican Conference follow your conscience? If you don't want to support them, don't do it?
I'm not going to tell. Oh, absolutely. The last thing I would do is tell anybody to do something that's contrary to their conscience. Of course I wouldn't do that. Look, believe me, Chuck, I get this. This is a very strange situation. This is a very unique nominee. But I feel as a responsibility institutionally as the Speaker of the House that I should not be leading some chasm in the middle of our party, because you know what I know that will do? That will definitely knock us out of the White House.
It's already divided.
I guess, well, it's divided, and I'm not going to tell somebody to go against their conscience.
So, Margaret, what are the implications of the Speaker's words to Chuck Todd?
It's really incredible. A vote of conscience, as we typically think of it, is like a vote on abortion or a vote on whether to go to war, not a vote on whether to support the nominee, presumptive nominee of your own party. Yeah. Of your own party. And so what he's doing is freeing everybody. What he's saying is if Trump becomes a bridge too far, detach from him and try to save the Senate and at least the House, you know. And it's a stunning. It has really stunning implications.
It opens the door for anybody without any fear that the Speaker will be unhappy. I think it opens the door to the Speaker doing the same thing. And this movement to try to change the rules of the convention, the leading alternative of a way to stop Trump now is to allow delegates to vote their conscience. So Paul Ryan using that word is like a dog whistle to the current whatever exists of the Stop Trump movement to say, if you think voting for Trump at the convention or supporting Trump in the fall is not in your interest, the party's interest, the country's interest, be my guest.
That's absolutely right. And then the convention structure that is now being rolled out is going to follow. And because Paul Ryan still is largely in control of this process, I mean, we're going to see a lot of kind of pieces of this come together in the next couple of days.
Yeah, and again, Chuck's interview with Speaker Ryan with lots more on Trump and everything else going on where this Sunday on Meet the Press. Interesting to see how people react to what Ryan has said. All right, that brings us to our next big Republican who had to deal with Trump, at least indirectly this week, George W. Bush. The New York Times is reporting that the former president is doing a round of fundraising for embattled Senate candidates, such as John McCain of Arizona and Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire. Margaret, with reports from Republicans, we're hearing that Trump's polling freefall is having a deleterious effect on the political health of down-ballot candidates, including a lot of Senate candidates. What are the implications of Dubya getting involved in this way?
It's really interesting. Sort of on one very basic level, it's great for George W. Bush because he spent a fair amount of time in exile, kind of partly of his own doing, waiting for his legacy and reputation to settle in a better way than when he left office, and this is really allowing him to come in and potentially avenge, you know, what happened to his brother Jeb, and solidify a name for himself if, in fact, he's able to help these Republicans who are in trouble. But it does sort of create a situation where he's appealing to the middle, to the old guard, to the center, to the establishment. But if there are enough Trump supporters who are turned off by some of these folks and don't want to vote for them in their own party, that could be a problem. But George W. Bush now being the cross-party appeal, you know, to the independent voters,
yeah,
and maybe some Democrats in these states. It's really interesting.
In some ways, it could help Trump as a bank shot, but I think directly when he speaks at these events, the symbolism it creates is, here's two Republican parties. There's the Bush establishment wing of the party, and then there's the Trump wing of the party. And these candidates clearly are going to be, a lot of them are going to be, at this point, more drawn to Bush than they are to Trump. And I think it's the kind of thing, although Donald Trump said this was fine with him, I think it's the kind of thing that just sows more division. Bush is, along with Mitt Romney, the most prominent people who say they're not going to show up at the convention in Cleveland. And I don't think that division is good for the party, but it does get one of their best fundraisers back on the field. It does take some pressure off of Trump to have to worry about maybe trying to raise money for these Senate candidates, because they're all, given the political situation going on right now, they're all desperate to raise as much as they can. And Bush, because of supply and demand, he's been off the field for so long, he's still got a pretty strong network in all these states where he's trying to help these candidates.
And Bush isn't Trump is not dying to raise money for himself. I mean, even so, it really, to that extent, it does, but it does further these divisions also.
Yeah. All right. One last big Republican who got entangled with Trump this week is one of those Senate incumbents who's in battle. John McCain yesterday told reporters that President Obama is, quote, directly responsible for the mass shooting in Orlando because of policies that allowed the rise of the Islamic State. When that remark was compared by some to the rhetoric of Trump from his campaign, McCain walked it back. He put out a statement that said in part, quote, I did not mean to imply that the president was personally responsible. I was referring to President Obama's national security decisions, not the president himself. That walk back didn't stop the story from reverberating today back in Arizona. Here's what the senator woke up to this morning on local TV.
Senator John McCain is clarifying some comments he made about the Orlando mass shooting, blaming President Obama.
4:32 in this morning, Senator John McCain walking back comments he made about the president and the Orlando terror attack.
Senator John McCain is backtracking on a bold statement he made.
Backpedaling somewhat from statements he made yesterday. He's facing criticism for blaming the Orlando attack on President Obama.
His likely Democratic challenger, Ann Kirkpatrick, said, quote, today we saw John McCain cross a dangerous line in comments that undermine our commander-in-chief on national security issues.
All right, so Margaret, what lessons can we learn about the current and future state of the party from John McCain's situation here with this walkback?
We've seen this before to some extent. There are sometimes when John McCain is really his worst enemy, and I'm going to say this would be one of those times. And it's been kind of awful to watch the last several weeks, the positions that he feels that he's been forced into. The president was hoping he would accompany him on this Asia trip to Vietnam. He felt like he couldn't do that because of the election. Now this, and even his walk back, it's not really a walk back. It's kind of like a halfway sort of awkward walk back. But John McCain, the 2008 nominee for his party, is now, really in a lot of trouble. And Trump has got him in a really uncomfortable position because he disagrees just instinctively with so much that Donald Trump is doing. And yet he can't help himself from getting halfway there sometimes. And Trump's dragging him down with that part of the vote that he really, needs.
Yeah, there's no doubt that there are a lot of Arizona voters who John McCain needs to vote for him in the general election who like Trump. At the same time, McCain says stuff like this all the time. To me, what this highlights is, for McCain and for a lot of other people, that not only do they need to comment on what Trump says, but the press and the Democrats are now on high alert for controversial statements, saying things that are like what Trump says, in this case pretty specifically close to what Trump says. And that means they're going to lose some news cycles, because when they make mistakes, they're going to have to figure out, do you walk it back? Do you apologize? Do you try to, like Trump does, basically bull through it? It's an uncomfortable situation. I think McCain is not going to be the last person who has to deal with that dynamic.
Yeah, backpedaling is not the headline you want out of anything you ever say.
Yeah, and the other thing is McCain, obviously, and Trump have a pretty rough history. McCain cannot like the dynamic that he sees in front of him. All right, Trump clearly not getting any lifelines from those three Republicans we just talked about, Ryan, Bush, 43, or McCain. So, Margaret, at this point, is there anybody out there in the Republican Party who, if they decided they wanted to help stop this Trump slide, besides Trump himself and the people working for him, is there anybody who could turn the narrative around?
Well, the key is what you just said, is if they wanted to. Of course there are. There are women in the Republican Party. There are Hispanics in the Republican Party. There are Hispanic women in the Republican Party. And there's the leadership of the Republican Party. The problem is every time they sort of make their peace with kind of getting comfortable with something that he does, he'll come out and do something like Judge Curiel or what we've seen in the last couple of days following the mass shooting in Orlando. I think governors from key states, potentially, especially female governors, are probably his best hope at this point.
Yeah, our colleagues wrote a piece about that that's on BloombergPolitics.com right now about Trump's appeal, the campaign reaching out to governors, trying to get support from Republican governors, thinking that they can trump in some way, pun intended, members of Congress. But I got to tell you, there was a movement afoot over about a week and a half ago to get people in the party to come out and say, stop criticizing Trump, stop dividing. We need the party to come together. This is our nominee. That movement, as best I can tell, is dead. No one wants to go out and be assertively for Trump, with the exception of people like Reince Priebus, who institutionally must be, because they're worried that they'll come out and say that, and the next thing that will happen is they'll do something they'll feel the need to repudiate, and they won't be in a position to be scolding other Republicans for not being full-throated in their support.
Yeah, it's just an absolute free fall over the last week and a half or so. It's not a good situation, and he's the only person who can save him from himself right now.
So I know we agree that it's unlikely that anybody will do it, but if Trump could tap any one person in the party on the shoulder and say, you need to come out for me full-throated, who do you think would be the most helpful? Again, assuming, leaving aside the fact that a lot of people don't want to do it.
Right, besides Paul Ryan. I mean, some of the bulwark of the party establishment, or again, perhaps some female governors.
Yeah.
I'm really stuck. I'm stumped. I mean, Newt Gingrich, Jeff Sessions, you keep hearing these names. How does that reach across the bridge? How does that reach women and independent voters?
Yeah, very tough situation. All right, Margaret Talev, thanks very much. Great to see you. When we come back, we bring in another guest host and talk more Trump. We'll look at the week that was through our patented prism of dissension, data, and donors in the GOP world, after this word from our sponsors. A few days ago, we used the famous 3 Ds to catalog Donald Trump's travails: dissension, data, and donors within the Republican ranks. Because it's Friday, we're going to check in on those same dimensions with NBC News' Katie Tur, who's here to lend a hand this block. Katie covers Trump, of course. And Katie, I want to start with dissension. NBC News and Politico both reported that there is tension now between the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign. After those reports, the chairman of the party, Reince Priebus, sent out this very Trumpian tweet, quote, "Flying to Dallas now with @real Donald Trump. Reports of discord are pure fiction. Great events lined up all over Texas. Ours will win in November," even included the exclamation point. Today, the RNC announced that former party chairman Haley Barbour will head up the GOP's convention organization committee next month. That'll give him influence over the floor action. And the national committee woman from Utah, which was one of Trump's worst states during the nomination season and where polls suggest he's in a fight with Clinton, will chair the powerful convention rules committee. So, Katie, as you understand it here as the week ends, what is the state of play between the Republican Party and the Trump campaign? Is there dissension above the norm or just at the norm?
Well, that Reince tweet was very interesting, wasn't it? Didn't it sound just like Donald Trump with the exclamation points and the cadence and everything? That's certainly a public showing of support from the chairman to his nominee. But behind the scenes, Hallie Jackson and I have been reporting, and Politico reported as well. We had 6 different sources describe what has been deteriorating trust between the two sides and some tensions that have been building, each one thinking that the other is only out for themselves. The RNC, and we've talked about this so many times, Mark, encouraging and trying to get Donald Trump and his team to hire more people. That not happening. They still don't have a communications team in place. Usually the campaigns will at least match the RNC, if not take the lead when it comes to staffing up in battleground states. But Donald Trump and his team, though, essentially just relying on the RNC to bolster them instead of finding a way to work together and to build out an effective plan. The Trump campaign, for its part, we should say, denies this report, says that they have a great relationship with the RNC.
You know, you're going to see, I think, increased tension as the convention approaches. With Game 6 over in the NBA Finals last night, the Republicans take over the building, but there's a lot of decisions to be made. You always see that tension between the National Party and the nominees' team about planning the convention. But as I understand it, there are a lot of decisions left to be made, and the friction over those things is growing pretty high as well. There are some people at the RNC who want everything to be friendly, but as you just said, not everybody thinks it's so friendly right now. All right, let's go, Katie, to our next D. That is data. There's still more national polling that continues to suggest Donald Trump is in some trouble. Many commentators are pointing out the fact that the presumptive Republican nominee, formerly the bragger-in-chief when it came to his poll standing, is now taken to denouncing the polls, as he did last night in Dallas. Katie, how big a problem is it for Trump that he can no longer go to his rallies and talk about how he's winning?
We're going to have to see. You know, he did say in Atlanta the other night that he talked about these phony polls, which is the day that a number of really bad polls came out against him. And then yesterday to Maggie, or today to Maggie Haberman, he admitted for, I think, the first time that he is down in the polls. So it's an uncharacteristic self-awareness from the candidate, which does seem to point to him actually realizing that something needs to be done. I think that's why we saw maybe a more moderated speech from him in Dallas last night. But this is an issue, and the campaign knows it's an issue. But Donald Trump seems to be saying that he doesn't believe that he's going to be doing poorly when it comes to, you know, August, September. Remember, they feel like they are the underdogs, regardless of how they did in the primaries.
You know, the public polling on the horse race gets a ton of attention, but there's 2 separate sets of data that continue to be an increasing source of problem for Republicans who are worried about Trump at the top of the ticket. One is his unfavorability rating, not just the overall unfavorability that the Washington Post had at 70, but with some really important groups. And this election is not going to be won solely on the backs of white men. And with other groups, Trump's in big trouble. And the other thing is the private data. All these Senate races, all these House candidates who can afford polling are going into the field, and what they're finding is Trump is hurting them. And while the Trump campaign obviously has other things to focus on, it is focusing the mind of Mitch McConnell, of Paul Ryan, and of their donors and of their political advisors who are saying, is this really going to be our fate to have to deal with this problem? Can Trump turn it around? Maybe. But they're increasingly pessimistic that he can, and that if he doesn't, that they can survive Trump having the kind of numbers he has now if those carry into the fall, with the Clinton advertising against him just now beginning. All right, Katie, lastly, the donor class. Trump's in Texas, continuing on a fundraising tour, and he's in Houston today raising money. That caps off a week of fundraisers where he went to Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. Next week, he's going to buck rake here in Gotham City with some big names like the private equity investor Steven Feinberg and the real estate magnate Peter Calico. So Trump seems to be doing a lot of fundraising. Has, Katie, he solved his donor problem?
He hasn't yet solved his donor problem, but we are told that last night from a few sources that he was able to raise about $6 million. That's a good haul for one night in Dallas. I believe last time, around that time when Mitt Romney was down there, he only raised about $3.4 million. But let's be realistic. He is so far behind where Mitt Romney was back in 2012. He is so far behind where Hillary Clinton was. Think about it this way. Mitt Romney was raising about, I think, $100 million a month at one point for this election. Hillary Clinton already raising tons of money right now. The campaign, Donald Trump's campaign, has a steep hill to climb. What they do have on their side, though, is a change in the rules. Now individual donors can, I think, give about 3 times as much as they were able to give in 2012. Yep. $97,000 as opposed to $32,000. So he can only needs to rely on a smaller amount of people to give a larger amount of money.
That rule change is clearly going to help with hard dollars. The two things that astound me with another week gone by is there are 2 areas where Trump could be raising big money where I don't see any indication that he is. One is they still haven't designated a super PAC that they consider to be their go-to super PAC. And the other is small dollars. Trump has
it's
a popular
message for him, though.
Yeah. Well,
the super PAC idea is off message.
But they're going to have to do it. And if they don't, they're going to be leaving a lot of money on the table. And then the other thing is small dollars, which is very much on message. You know, Bernie Sanders showed you could raise a ton of money on the internet just by going on TV and asking. Trump has grassroots support. People write him letters. People go on social media and support him. Why they're not out there raising big money and bragging about it so money begets money is beyond me, because that is an area, as you suggested, right on message where they could raise a lot more.
Well, I think that the problem, Mark, is that the idea that he's going to go out and bless a super PAC goes counter to everything he said during the primary. I also think it's counter to Donald Trump as a person, as a businessman. He doesn't like to go out and ask for money in that way. But when it comes to those smaller donors, I think you're absolutely right. They relied on them very much in the primaries. Why are they not touting how much money they're making? Yeah. It makes you wonder, are they making that much?
Does make you wonder. Katie Tur, thanks very much. Up next, we'll bring in our last mystery guest host to talk about what Bernie Sanders said last night and, more importantly, what he's achieved already after a quick commercial break. Late last night, Bernie Sanders made a live online video address to his supporters around the country. He did not drop out of the race officially or endorse Hillary Clinton, and he did not make his posture toward the convention in Philadelphia next month much clearer than it's been so far.
The major political task that together we face in the next 5 months is to make certain that Donald Trump is defeated and defeated badly. And I personally intend to begin my role in that process in a very short period of time. But defeating Donald Trump cannot be our only goal. We must continue our grassroots effort to create the America that we know we can become. And we must take that energy into the Democratic National Convention on July 25th in Philadelphia, where we will have more than 1,900 delegates.
MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt, who covers the Clinton campaign now, but a lot of time with Bernie Sanders, joins us as our third guest host. So, Casey, he's got a legacy, regardless of what he ends up doing in Philadelphia. Let's talk first about policy. What kind of impact do you think he had and is having on the Democratic Party and the country on policy?
Right, starting with a place that I think Bernie Sanders would want us all to start, and that he spent a lot of this race, complaining that we didn't focus enough on. I think he clearly demonstrated that there's an appetite in the country, that millions of people wanted to come out and support a lot of these reforms that he has been pushing forward on economic policy. For example, minimum wage, health care, single-payer health care for all, free college tuition. Of course, these are ideas that, generated some ridicule from people inside the Clinton campaign privately, who said, you know what, these are all, pipe dreams. He says that he doesn't know how to pay for it, but clearly people were responding to that. And the second big thing, I think, that was a huge part of his stump speech, and I think very much motivating for a lot of these especially young supporters, was campaign finance reform, and this ability of people to buy into his campaign in small amounts, and that he was arguing that was a fundamental policy change that actually, in his view, could really reshape basically the entire political system as it currently exists.
Yes, and Casey, what about the political legacy? What did he do that was different that you think endures for himself and for the party?
I think that the top line is actually on this issue of finance reform. It's funny. It's a policy priority that could be addressed with legislation. He certainly wants to do that. But he proved by the campaign that he ran that it is possible to mount a presidential campaign. He outraised Hillary Clinton without chapping big donors. I mean, having covered him for months, as you know, covering fundraisers is a big part, typically, of being out on the road with a candidate. And we never went to fundraisers, hardly, with Bernie Sanders. So I think that was a significant political change.
Big legacy. Casey Hunt, thank you very much. We'll be right back. Our next guest is a Republican strategist and Mitt Romney's 2012 deputy campaign manager who has done work for the anti-Trump Our Principles PAC. Katie Packer joins us from Washington. Katie, great to see you.
Good to see you, Mark.
So, as you know, there's a fair amount of chatter about some delegates to the convention trying to overcome the obstacles to getting rules changes to keep Donald Trump from being the nominee. From a rules perspective, not a PR perspective, from a rules perspective, what's your sense of how possible that is?
I think it's really possible because the rules that apply to this convention are actually made at this convention. You know, really everything that happens up until then is kind of a guideline more than anything. So there is a real possibility, according to a lot of, you know, experts that have really paid close attention to this, you know, people like Curly Haugland, who's been kind of touting this for years, that, you know, that there really is no such thing as bound delegates, that once the delegates get there, they can vote to change the rules and determine, you know, whether or not they want people to be bound by what happened in their home states or not. I do think that this is a process that's going to have to originate with delegates and not with Washington.
So today, as we mentioned earlier, the Republican National Committee announced that the National Committee woman from Utah is going to head the Rules Committee, and Haley Barbour is going to play a role at the convention, managing the floor to some extent when Paul Ryan's not doing it. Based on your knowledge or tea leaf reading, what do you think of those two decisions?
Well, I mean, certainly both are people that, you know, have been around for a long time, know the process, know what goes on at a convention, and I do think that there has been some concern that, you know, that a lot of the folks that Trump is involving are people that haven't been engaged in any real way in such a long time, that they really did need to have some people that have some expertise and some experience that's a little bit more current. And, you know, both of those folks are people that have been involved the last several conventions in some way, and so I think it does bring you know, some sort of bolster you know, what the RNC needs to keep control of the convention.
I take your point that this is more likely to be effective if it's organic and grassroots from the delegates, but most Republicans I'm talking to say that this movement to change the rules to in effect try to stop Donald Trump is not going to happen unless Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan get behind it. Whether you agree with that or not, if Mitch McConnell called you up and said, Katie, make your best case for why I should risk going against the will of the voters and put my influence behind trying to change the rules and stop Trump, what's your best case to Mitch McConnell?
Well, I mean, I do think, like I said, that this is something that would have to be organic and come from the delegates on the floor, and maybe it would have the blessing of people like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, but I do think it would be a bad thing for them to in any way appear as though they're leading this charge. You know, Donald Trump did win these primaries, but a lot has happened since then. He has, you know, usually I love being right. This is one case where I really take no pleasure in being right, but this is exactly what we predicted in the spring was going to happen, that Donald Trump would be a disaster for our party. He would not change. He is sort of Johnny one note, only knows how to be one way, and it's proving to be disastrous for our party. And you know, I think if he has another couple of weeks like the last couple of weeks, you know, the delegates and the leaders in the party are going to, you know, really start to talk in earnest about what we do come Cleveland.
Well, it wasn't that long ago that Hillary Clinton was having some bad weeks. Michael Dukakis was up 17 points in the summer of 1988. Are you ruling out the fact that Trump could start performing better and come back and win this, or not?
Well, I think that the difference between Donald Trump and any of these other candidates is these other candidates have proven to be willing to listen to sound advice and counsel. And when they've been down, they've sort of, you know, revamped their strategy and decided to go a different way. Donald Trump is 70 years old. I don't think he's going to wholesale change his personality, and he only knows how to campaign in a way that appeals to a certain segment of the population, and those are not the voters that we need to get over the top. You know, he clearly has his supporters locked in. They're not going to go anywhere. But, you know, you've seen the very high disapproval ratings that he has. You know, 55% of American voters this week said that they would never vote for Trump. We've never seen anything like this. This is catastrophic. And if something doesn't change, it's going to be really devastating down ballot.
Katie, who are the second and third most likely presidential nominees at this point?
Wow, that's a really tough thing. I mean, I do think, you know, if my money is on Donald Trump continuing to be the nominee, even though I think it's going to be a very, very tough thing for our party. But, you know, I think several of the candidates that ran this year would be, you know, plausible options. You know, certainly somebody like John Kasich, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. You know, these were all people that, you know, sort of finished strong, you know, second, third, and fourth places. You know, and any of these candidates, I think, would be stronger candidates in a general election. And had they won, I would have been happy to rally around any of the other candidates. But Donald Trump is sort of a unique bird. We've got a very weak opposition in Hillary Clinton, the most vulnerable Democratic candidate probably, you know, in several decades. And we somehow managed to nominate the one guy that can underperform her. So any of those candidates would be stronger.
So the only way someone is the nominee besides Trump is with a fair amount of chaos in Cleveland. And there's no consensus. I mean, again, the conversations I've had today, people talk about Paul Ryan. They talk maybe about a Ryan Rubio ticket or a Kasich Rubio ticket. But there would be chaos. The Trump delegates, for instance, the ones who are very loyal to Trump would go crazy, his voters would. Is there a way for that scenario to play out where the convention isn't just a huge mess and bad for the party?
Well, I think if something like that were to happen, of course the convention would be incredibly chaotic. You know, the question is, do the delegates in Cleveland decide that they just are willing to go down with the ship, or are they going to stand up and try to prevent that? You know, like I said, I don't think that today that's very likely to happen. I do think if there's a couple more weeks like this last week, I do think that the environment could be created where people sort of say enough is enough. Look, Mark, the bottom line is he's better than Hillary is not a compelling message for a general election. And I think that people are beginning to realize that that's the only thing that they can say that in any way resembles, you know, a compelling reason for Republicans to support Trump. And it's just, you know, people are starting to get very frustrated with it.
So, Katie, again, I know you've thought long and hard at various stages along the way about what the best outcome would be. Given that you're pretty confident that Trump's going to be the nominee, how would you like things to play out that would be in the best interest of the party and the country?
Well, I mean, I do think that candidates that allow some distance between them and Trump are the smart candidates come fall. I think candidates that embrace him too closely are embracing, you know, a ticking time bomb. And in terms of, you know, doing what we can to hold on to the Senate with very, very strong candidates in Portman and Ayotte and others across the country, you know, providing some level of arm's length distance so that they aren't responsible for everything he says, and we try to hold on these down ballot seats, that may be the best we can hope for.
Okay, Katie Packer, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Up next, more on the trials and tribulations for the down ballot Republicans right now running with Donald Trump. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can listen to this program on the radio anytime at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back. Coming to us now from the city of the Diamondbacks and Pizzeria Bianco, best in the nation, Phoenix, Arizona, the national political reporter for the Arizona Republic, Dan Nowicki, who covers John McCain closely. Dan, what's your take on how John McCain behaved in the last 48 hours, talking about President Obama, and how much is that in the shadow both of Donald Trump and his reelection?
Well, I think it does have a lot to do with his reelection. McCain's obviously in a very delicate position. He's got a big part of the Arizona Republican Party who views him as too liberal. They've censured him in the past, so on the one hand, he really likes to look tough against President Obama. And I've noticed in past years, one of the ways he does that is he really takes on Obama hard on national security and foreign policy issues. And that's what he was doing here. And I think he went too far. I think he probably did misspeak a little bit. I don't think he probably would have gone into that conversation with the reporters intending to personally blame President Obama for Orlando. But I have heard him make variations on that same argument many times in the past, that he blames Obama's policies in Iraq for the rise of ISIS.
Yeah, I agree with you. He says stuff like that all the time. In this case, though, Dan, he felt compelled to take it back. Let me bring in our colleague Carl Hulse, New York Times chief correspondent from Washington. Carl, you are a longtime McCain watcher. You've heard him say, as Dan pointed out, plenty of stuff about President Obama that he does not ask to take back, and he does it. Why is the context here different, do you think?
I think, to me, obviously people are pretty on edge in Washington over this Trump thing, as we call it. I think that he came to a quick realization that he needed to take that back. John McCain's in a tough race, and he's going to need Democrats to win. He can't rely on those Democrats if he's going to go trashing the president like that. So I think that was part of his calculation, and he just knew he'd gone too far. I mean, he has a sense of self, and he likes to say these things and be provocative, but he also knows sometimes you got to get out of it.
So Dan, set the stage for this general election race. Just how tough a contest does he have against a congresswoman who has been very aggressive in criticizing McCain all across the board, including for these latest comments?
Well, he's got a very formidable opponent this year in Ann Kirkpatrick. And I think just the atmosphere in the battlefield is just terrible for McCain, with Trump at the top of the ticket. And we have a late Republican primary. Our primary isn't until August 30th. So he's kind of got to watch what he says about Trump until at least he gets through the primary. And then I suspect you'll see McCain starting to put a lot of distance between himself and Trump as he proceeds on this general election against Kirkpatrick. But it's a frustrating position for him. He's kind of stuck in the middle. He kind of lucked out a little bit in his primary. There were a couple of Republican conservative congressmen that the groups like Freedom Works and the Club for Growth were really trying to push into the race, and they both decided not to do so. And he does have some primary opponents, but the general consensus is he probably can make it through the primary okay. That would have been a different story had a incumbent House member run against him, probably. And so he's just biding his time, hoping to get through this next couple of months until he gets through his primary.
Yeah. So, Carl, in the ring of potentially vulnerable Republican Senate seats, that Arizona seat is one. The Missouri seat is one that people who worried about the Trump effect have.
North Carolina.
Then there's Florida, where every indication I have, and I think you do too, that Senator Rubio is going to run. What I heard today from two Republican sources is that Senator Rubio is thinking about announce and denounce. And how does he sequence that? That he wants to not run having embraced Trump the way he did, and that he's being advised you need at some point in the early phases of a candidacy to make it clear that you're not with Trump. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, I think that he'll have to do something like that. It's going to be a really tricky run for Senator Rubio if he does decide to do this. I don't think he's a shoo-in. He's going to have a tough race. I'll tell you one thing. In some ways, this might be good for Senator McCain, because the Democrats are going to pour a ton of money into Florida. I talked to Harry Reid this week. He personally told me, he's like, I'm not happy. We're going to have to spend a lot of money in Florida, but I'm going to spend a lot of money in Florida. So that might shift some of the resources they would use against McCain. But I think that Senator Rubio is going to have a tough time. One thing I wanted to say about McCain, Senator McCain, on his comments, what they did there was they fed this narrative that the Democrats are trying to create. This is not the same old John McCain that you used to know, the Maverick, the Straight Talk Express. John McCain has changed. And those kind of comments and his position on Garland, I think, are really helping the Democrats. But a lot of great Senate races in this cycle to take a look at.
Yeah. Dan, Arizona has been a very good state for Donald Trump. He has a lot of support there, and obviously immigration is an issue that is a hot button in the state. As it's been perceived in the last couple weeks that he's in trouble and the national numbers are bad, what are Arizona Republicans, beyond John McCain, saying about the Trump candidacy?
I think they're pretty uneasy about Trump at the top of the ticket. I think gradually they're starting to come around. I think Governor Doug Ducey, who's a Republican, is going to probably attend one of the events that Donald Trump has in Phoenix on Saturday. He's actually coming to town on Saturday. He's coinciding with a deadly heat wave that's also coming to Phoenix. But I think they're coming around, and I think part of the argument they're making is it's sort of, he's not a great conservative by any means, but he's preferable to Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, Carl,
there are some exceptions. There are some exceptions, like Senator Jeff Flake, who has not endorsed.
Right, and
yeah,
been pretty
Flake is.
Against.
Yeah, he's really leading the charge there.
Yeah, Carl, of all the Washington Republicans was standing here, who do you think today is both most uneasy about Trump and actively strategizing about what to do about it?
Well, I think Mitch McConnell, obviously, he's playing this in a pretty interesting way. He says he's supporting the nominee, but he also bashes Trump. I think that he's a guy to watch. He's watching this through the prism of the Supreme Court vacancies and his own majority, right? So right now he thinks it's in his interest to kind of play it the way he is and be out there saying, I'm okay with Trump. As soon as he decides it's not in his interest, he's going to not be okay with Trump and cut his incumbents loose. So I think he's watching. I think Paul Ryan, the speaker, he's having a heck of a time with this. He's not for him. He's for him. He's kind of for him. And he's got a different set of imperatives than McConnell does. But I've got my eye on Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, I do too. The more polling data that comes in, if it keeps the trend line keeps going on these Senate races in New Hampshire, in Ohio, in North Carolina, in Missouri, if the trend line keeps going the way it is, I think McConnell's going to have to come up with a new strategy. It may not mean try to stop Trump at the convention, but it does mean coming up with a different strategy of how his incumbents talk about Trump, I think.
Yeah, I think he was quoted by Jonathan Martin earlier this year that they'd drop him like a hot rock, and I know he would. He's not going to sit by and easily lose the majority. I mean, I think they've got some real problems hanging on to their majority, but he'll make a move if he has to.
Yeah, Dan, you're a great student of John McCain's body language. He always runs scared. That's just his nature. Do you think he's really worried about losing this race, or just being cautious?
No, I think he is probably legitimately worried, but you're right. He takes every race seriously, and he always runs like he could lose. And so he's doing that, and that's maybe something that may wind up saving McCain in the end, is the fact that he took this serious from the very start, even before Trump.
What kind of candidate skills does Congresswoman Kirkpatrick have? Is she a good candidate?
Well, she's not very well known yet statewide, I don't think. She represents a very large rural Arizona district. Several Indian communities in her district, so she's got to get herself known, I think, a little bit more in Maricopa County, where most of the voters are. But I think she is a 3-term House member. She was elected. She got defeated in 2010, and then she's been reelected 2 more times since then.
Right.
She supported the Affordable Care Act too, which is a McCain issue.
Right. That's what McCain's after her on, and she's after him on building the fence. I talked to Senator Flake about this race recently, and he thinks that that McCain has a big enough brand of his own that he can kind of overcome this. He thinks he'll be okay. But everyone knows this is going to be John McCain's toughest race. And, some people think Arizona's in play. That's not going to be good for him. So he's going to have to keep his composure, though, I think, and he recognizes that. Yeah,
easier said than done when we're talking about John McCain. All right, Carl Hall, Stan Nowicki, thank you guys both. Have a great weekend. Up next, it's a debate that has been raging for months. We're going to parse out Donald Trump's words syllable by syllable when we come back. Finally tonight, an issue that is dividing America in a bigly way. Or is it a big league way? If you don't know what I'm talking about, let's get you caught up.
Donald Trump, big league. Here's what happened. Trump gives a speech and says,
"Someday, I believe that will be proven out. Big league."
Twitter says LOL. A man who says bigly is running for America's. But wait, Twitter says not so fast. I can never tell if he's saying bigly or big league. Listen again.
Big league.
Slow it down.
Big league.
He said it before.
We are going to start winning big league.
Sounds like big league.
I would be helping out Israel. Big league.
Wait, but that sounds like bigly. People on TV agree.
Bigly, not a word.
Bigly? That's not a word.
You hit me, I'll hit you back bigly.
But people on TV also disagree.
It's big league. No, it's big league.
The world may never know.
Big league. Big league. Big league.
Big league.
Big league. Big league.
All right, it is true that we may never know, but let's turn now to our big league decision desk. They've been up all night into today trying to get to the bottom of this. Guys, I know you've been working the phones. Matt Negrin, what are you finding?
The overwhelming evidence supports the big league conclusion. One word, B-I-G-L-Y. Trump has not said big league. You would hear the G at the end if that's the case. I've got a great example of a radio interview that Trump did. This just came in. Take a listen.
Absolutely, there's an assault on Christianity, and we're going to reverse that trend bigly.
I didn't hear a G at the end. I didn't hear a G at all. Bigly. He clearly says big.
So, Negrin, you're finding big league. I know, Alex, from a note you sent me, you still think it's big league.
Clearly big league. Trump has a well-known habit of dropping his G's. Just ask Lion Ted and listen to this.
And she wants to raise your taxes. Big league, folks. Big league.
What is the Trump campaign saying on the record about this?
Hope Hicks has said that it is big league.
Oh, you're going to take Hope Hicks' word for it? She says the RNC has a great relationship with the Trump campaign. Come on.
All right, so Trowbridge says big league.
No, I'm making the call over here. It's
Negrin
big
says big league. The debate continues. The decision desk will stay on it. We'll bring you the latest throughout the program. Exactly. And we'll be right back. Thanks to our trio of co-hosts today. You can check out BloombergPolitics.com for Zach Miter's story on companies who are opting out of the Republican convention. It's having an impact on the Democrats as well. And coming up here on Bloomberg West, Jim Flagging of the Chertoff Group talks about the intersection of terrorism and social media, a timely topic, as they say. Thanks for watching. We'll be back here next week, same bad time, same bad channel. Until Monday, sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's start with a check of your first word news. Defense Secretary Ash Carter's blasting Russia for bombing U.S.-backed rebel forces in southern Syria. He says they were fighting Islamic State. Secretary Carter called Russia's actions problematic. He suggests the Russian military misused a channel of communication with the U.S. military that's intended to prevent unsafe U.S. and Russian air operations over Syria. Iraq's prime minister says government forces have gained control over most of Fallujah. Earlier, the commander of Iraqi special forces told the Associated Press his troops control about 80% of the city, with Islamic State militants concentrated in several districts on the city's northern edge. The voice and data recorders from the Egypt airplane that crashed into the Mediterranean nearly a month ago are extensively damaged and will need repairs before they can be analyzed. That's according to the Associated Press, citing an Egyptian official. Searchers recovered the second of the black boxes today. In the wake of the Orlando, Florida massacres, Senate Democrats pushed Republicans to allow a vote on their proposal that the government be allowed to prevent anyone on a terrorist watch list from buying a gun. Republicans disagree. They say a court should have to sign off on a no-buy order. Global news 24 hours a day. From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York, I'm Mark Crumpton.
Asensio in for Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg West. Coming up. Apple facing the threat of a sales freeze in China after Beijing said the iPhone maker was violating patents of a small domestic rival. How serious are those allegations? We'll break them down. Plus, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates sits down exclusively with Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker. We'll hear his views on the newly inked LinkedIn deal. And Hollywood dips its toes into the world of virtual reality. We'll take a look at how film studios are using it and why the gaming industry is still sitting on the sidelines. But first, to our lead. Apple hit with a potentially devastating patent dispute in China. The Beijing Intellectual Property Office has found that the iPhone 6 and iPhone 6 Plus are too similar in appearance to the 100C phone made by a Chinese company called Baili. The ruling there could block future sales of the phones in Beijing unless Apple can overturn that ruling. Apple quickly fired back, saying that it had already appealed and all of its iPhone 6 models remain on sale in China. All of this coming at a bad time for Apple, though, which is already dealing with slowing iPhone sales and gearing up to roll out the next model. Investors sent shares down about 2% in Friday trading, and RBC joined JP Morgan in slashing its price target for the stock. So how big a deal is this, really? Technalysis Research President Bob O'Donnell joins us from San Francisco, and with me for the